Genesis 1:27 was something that he held to. It was interesting because the court made this statement to him. And it said this: belief in Genesis 1:27, lack of belief in transgenderism and conscientious objection to transgenderism, in our judgment, are incompatible with human dignity and conflict with the fundamental rights of others, specifically here, the transgender individuals. This individual was actually removed from his position after 26 years. And essentially what the courts were saying here is that Bible belief is incompatible with human dignity. Now, is this something that's just happening in the UK? And the answer is no. In the previous administration in our land, it was interesting because it was very subtle, but yet you were seeing it. It was not the freedom of religion, it was freedom of worship. And that is what you were hearing. Now, do understand something. What is the difference between freedom of religion and freedom of worship? Freedom of religion is that which is in the Constitution, the ability for you to believe, to have your religious beliefs, and to express those. Freedom of worship is that when we come into this place, we can do what we want. But once you walk out that door, you cannot. And it's important as we go through the passage of Scripture here in Zechariah that we're keeping this in mind of understanding that there are some interesting days. We are in some interesting days, but to realize that God most certainly is in the details. With that, let us begin to look at these passages that speak of God being in the details. Also, as we begin here, one of the things that I've said over the last two times, and I think it's also very important as well, of that Rabbi Jekara, who was in the 1000 AD time frame, that spoke concerning Zechariah, and he made this statement, and I'll say it again, that we shall never be able to discover the true interpretation of this book of Zechariah until the teacher of righteousness arrives. And as we look at these things of the details, realize that Zechariah writes 400 years before Jesus comes on the scene. So let us now move to the first passage of Scripture that we will look at here as we deal with God in the details. The first one is in Zechariah 9. And there'll be two verses that we'll be dealing with exclusively, 9 and 10. Do understand that as you look at the earlier aspects of 9, it deals with the judgments that God is bringing. But here, as he speaks of the judgments, he also speaks of God's hand moving among the people and him bringing deliverance. Hear now Zechariah 9, verses 9 and 10. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea and from river to the ends of the earth. And to understand, as we're looking at this passage, it is speaking of the state of the nation. Here, the nation of Israel has come back, or the nation of Judah has come back from exile. And do understand, the situation is very tentative. There is much going on, and it is not necessarily getting better. We are clearly not seeing it for the Jew of looking back to the days of David or Solomon, when the kingdom were in, amazing, those kingdoms that God had given both David and Jerusalem and Solomon. But here, as he speaks, what we see here is thy king. That through thy king, the coming one, is described as the king appointed for Zion. And the promise to the covenant nation, the covenant that God had made with his people, that he would bring the king to them. And indeed, that the Messiah is intended here, that whose coming is predicted in Isaiah and Isaiah 9, 5 and 6, also in Micah 5, 1, and other prophets, is admitted by most of those of the Jewish and the Christian commentators, that this is speaking of Messiah who would come. Now, when we think about a king coming, how often does the king come? Does he ride upon a donkey? No, he usually rides upon a horse, a majestic war horse or something else of majesty. But here it's speaking of them riding upon a donkey. And you do understand that when we look elsewhere in, for instance, with David and things of this nature, we see this concept there. For instance, in 1 Kings 1:33, when David is dealing with Adonijah, his son, who has taken control of the king and proclaiming himself king as opposed to Solomon, David, as he deals with that, makes this statement. He says, "Take with you the servants of your Lord and have my son Solomon ride on my mule and bring him down to Gihon, where he would be anointed and where he would be crowned the next king." Indeed, the use of the riding on the mule here in Israel was for a place of those of in high importance. One of the things that the mules were never something that was created in Israel. They always had to import them because of the restrictions of interbreeding. And this, as one who is brought in from other countries, was indeed a symbol of status. But we don't really see it elsewhere mentioned as in Scripture concerning this. But here, as the prophecy comes, we really see that Jesus does fulfill this prophecy, but also he fulfills several others as well on the day that he takes Zechariah 9 and 10 and fulfills it in the presence of the people. We also see on that day that in Genesis 49, 9 through 11, where Jacob is speaking to Judah and giving him the blessings as Jacob is soon to die. And it's here he says that the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Messiah would come, or Shiloh is the term that is used. Also clearly known throughout Scripture and throughout the Jewish and Christian writers that this dealt with Messiah. And that this would happen, that the gathering of the people under the peacemaker would happen in that day when the scepter was removed from Judah. And we see that happening here. We also see in Daniel 9, 24 through 27, that Daniel gives us the date that Messiah will come. Again, it fulfilled on that day. The third being here of that of riding on the foal of a donkey. Now do understand something, that Jesus sets this up. It is not something that just happens. He isn't just coming into Jerusalem and he says, boy, I'm tired. He gets up on a donkey and starts riding in. He orchestrates this. Very compelling. Now do understand, why is this important? It is important because if you remember, as you look throughout Scripture, Jesus in the earlier days of his ministry, what did he constantly say to his disciples? What did he constantly say to people that he performed miracles with? He said, do not reveal anybody of who I am. Do not do that. But here, this is not the case. In fact, what he would say over and over again is, my time has not yet come. See that in Matthew 16, after Peter had pronounced that he indeed was the Son of God, the Messiah. He says, my time has not yet come. In John 12, we see verses 12 through 15, Jesus setting this up. Let me read it to you to put this in your mind. He said, on that day, the next great